I once was trying to explain this to somebody who had a lot of trouble understanding how what was empirically true was not what was objectively true. And I had to say, look, when you hear, Marxists, Leninists use the term objectively, just substitute the word subjectively and you'll get it.
Welcome to Unsafe Space, everyone. I'm your host, Carter Laren, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Gary Morson. Gary Saul Morson is a Laurent B. Dumas Professor of the Arts and Humanities and Professor of Russian Literature at Northwestern University. He's the author of numerous books on Russian literature. He's also written studies of the role of quotations in culture and the human experience of time. A book he co-authored with Northwestern President Morton Schapiro, Minds Wide Shut, How the New Fundamentalisms Divide Us, is forthcoming from Princeton University Press, and we'll put a link to that when it's available in the show notes. So with that, welcome to Unsafe Space, Dr. Morson.
I'm very glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, there's a lot I want to talk to you about. I mean, given the political and social turmoil of America today, many people are looking to glean lessons from other periods of civil unrest in history, including China's Cultural Revolution, the Reign of Terror in France, and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And without asking you to draw any parallels between historical events in modern America, I'd like to talk to you about some of the cultural and political dynamics that were at play in Russia in the early 20th century. And perhaps I should start here by just asking you to give us a brief overview of the Russian Revolution for those of us who are maybe unfamiliar with history.
Oh, that's a tall order. You're asking a professor to talk about one of his favorite topics. You have enough time on this show.
As long as you want. As long as you want.
Well, the Russian Revolution, which overthrew the Tsar and instituted the Bolshevik regime, was actually two revolutions. One in February, 1917, which brought in a provisional government, which never had any power, but which was trying to be a sort of a parliamentary type Western regime. And it was overthrown in a coup d'etat by a very small group of people, the Bolshevik Party, in October, our calendar, November 1917. And who had in mind from day one to set up a dictatorship with power more authoritarian and more total than had ever been seen before. And they succeeded in doing so. They created several new things. The form of government we call totalitarian, the one-party state that, the term party means a part. It'd be a one-party state, a private organization dictating to the government what would happen. That was entirely new. It was quite explicit from the start that they were going to base this state not just immediately, but permanently on terror as a means of controlling the population. Lenin, for example, who was the leader of the Bolsheviks, insisted that when a few years later, they were drawing up a law code for the new regime. The law code would explicitly state that terror, that is, extra legal activities, were legal. I know of no other law code in history that mandated, not just allowed, but mandated otherwise illegal activities whenever the party felt it was in its interest to use them, with no limitations whatsoever.
Wow.
So that was a completely new concept. It had never, the czars didn't remotely have anything remotely like that power, nor did they ever ask for it.
So, I mean, one thing that strikes me is during at the beginnings here, there was a lot of, you talk a lot about normalization of violence against targeted classes as a means to a political end. There's one quote you have in one of your articles that says, anyone wearing a uniform was a candidate for a bullet to the head or sulfuric acid to the face.
Well, that was before the revolution. That's in the pre-revolutionary period.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the pre-revolution a little bit because it seems like there was kind of widespread complacency about what was going to happen and what the end result of some of these ideas were?
Well, complacency doesn't go far enough. The educated population gave strong support to any and all forms of terrorism. And this included forms of terrorism not just directed, let's say, against high government officials, but against any government official, a post office clerk, against people at random, like throwing bombs laced with nails into cafes. And, you know, many, many thousands of people were killed and many more maimed by this over a period of, let's say, a dozen years before the revolution in the early 20th century. And the response of the, educated classes was to finance it. Businessmen who were going to be expropriated and shot paid for the revolutionaries to conduct their terrorist activities. The Liberal Party, the Cadets, which was opposed to terror as an activity of its own, supported it when done by the various revolutionary parties, not just the Bolsheviks. There were several revolutionary parties. And one leader famously said, renounce terrorism, that would be the moral ruin of the party. Every good person was in favor of whatever was more revolutionary. The term used at the time was revolutionism, a fascination with revolution in and of itself. You didn't even ask what was going to follow. Abolishing everything in the current system, destroying it from the ground up, was thought to be enough. Well, then we'll worry about it later. The Bolsheviks did have a specific plan, but many of the others were sort of rather vague. It wasn't polite to ask.
And how did it work out for the cadets after they kind of provided moral justification for this?
Well, in the first weeks of the regime, Lenin declared the Cadet Party outside the law. That was the first step, which meant that anyone could kill any cadet on sight. And two leaders were immediately killed in their hospital beds. And then he went off to, arresting, shooting, imprisoning, all the rest. That was followed by the same thing done with the other revolutionary parties, who was saying, we're fellow revolutionaries, you can't do that to us. But he did. He shot them, shot them, imprisoned them. The secret police was set up before 1917 was over, in December 1917. By that point, the secret police, armed with absolute power, including torture, terror, anything they wanted to do, was in place before 1917 was over. And they went after other revolutionaries.
So I financed you guys wasn't an excuse to like the bankers who financed some of this terrorism, that didn't get them out of the sights of the guns when the revolution happened, is what you're saying.
No, I mean, the main thing is why they would think that people who state all the time what they want to do is kill the entire capitalist class. You understand? They didn't just want to change the system. They wanted to get rid of all the evil people as a group, as a social class, which meant every aristocrat, of aristocratic heritage or of bourgeois heritage. It didn't matter what job you did. If your parents were bourgeois, that made you bourgeois. It's like a genetic trait, were to be executed. And it was class warfare. And that's what they went ahead doing. Lenin himself, who was a wonderfully skillful politician, who understood the psychology of these businessmen and these liberals, he's supposedly summed up his attitude to them by saying, when we are ready to hang the capitalists, they will sell us the rope. But in fact, he understated it, because he should have said, they will buy us the rope, and then they will hire us to use it on them. That would have been more accurate. They were paying for these people to do this,
So, I mean, this brings up a whole host of issues, not the least of which is the ethics of the so-called intelligence. And you've written about how they reduced ethics to politics, and removed all the moral responsibility from individuals. Could you maybe expound on that a little bit? I mean, you even mentioned a Vasily Grossman character who says the concept of innocence is a holdover from the Middle Ages.
Yeah, you're talking about the radical intelligentsia, a member of which was called an intelligent. It's a term we get from Russian intelligentsia, but in Russia, it didn't mean educated people. You didn't even have to be educated. And many educated people were not considered it, because if you had to be a revolutionary, an atheist, a materialist, some sort of revolutionary, it could be some sort of socialist or anarchist would do. They all had their different revolutionary philosophies, but the Bolsheviks, who were the most extreme, were committed to the idea that the absolutely only standard of good and evil was the interests of the party as the party defined it itself. The idea that, for example, the party should not do something, should not, let's say, engage in torture because it was immoral. If you said that, you were already showing you were not a Bolshevik, because it meant there was some standard other than the interests of the party. And that's part of what the Grossman characters mean. There's no innocence. It doesn't even matter what you do. If you are of the wrong, an order in the early days of the revolution, of the man who was number 2 of the secret police, said to his agents, when you arrest somebody, don't ask whether they have done anything or said anything against the regime. Ask about the person's social origin. Is he a bourgeois? Is he an aristocrat? And that's enough. If he is, you shoot him. Doesn't matter what he did. That's again why innocence is not an issue. It doesn't matter what you do. It matters what social class you belong to. That's the Bolshevik theory of history, you see. So, of course, human beings remain notions of guilt or innocence. It's hard to get rid of them, but they were, if you were a good Bolshevik, a good party member, you had to give them up. You were educated out of them. They did their best to get children to stop thinking in those terms. Another thing that was equivalent was compassion. Children were taught that compassion was a bad thing. I mean, we usually think, well, children are naturally selfish. You have to teach them to be compassionate. The Bolsheviks thought that people were naturally compassionate, and you had to teach them not for selfish reasons, but because if the party needed you to do something cruel, you had to be ready to do it without a moment's hesitation. So compassion was a bad thing. You say, this is amazing.
They actively educated children to not be kind, not be compassionate.
That's right. The word conscience basically disappeared from Russian discourse. It was replaced by the phrase for consciousness, as in class consciousness. Conscience disappeared. Conscience was an old-fashioned religious moral notion at odds with Bolshevik morality. So, people were not to be compassionate.
There was a lot of, I remember you writing that there was a lot of social pressure to conform leading up to this, in terms of just with your words, right? And you write a sentence, you say, soldiers who are brave under fire cower before progressive opinion. Can you talk about what the social pressure was like for some of these people and why they would support this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, actually, they're paraphrasing Alexander Solzhenitsyn's novel, August 1914, and its sequel, November 1916, which describes a lot of, set before the revolution and describing a lot of intellectual groups. And that's what, he describes in great detail, people in, let's say, it's an evening where a group of liberals have gotten together and the hero, who is, something else, is there. And he feels this enormous social pressure to say whatever they're saying. And he asks himself, what is it that makes me, I'm a soldier, I'm a colonel, I've been under fire. I'm not afraid of that. And yet I am afraid to express an illiberal opinion in a group of liberals. What is it that does it? Which is a real question, because lots of other people were having the same feeling. They couldn't get themselves to do it. It's not they were otherwise cowards. There was some mental pressure that you just don't challenge the liberal consensus. And he describes the psychology of it, and it's a really wonderful passage in those novels. I know of no other novelist that, who really describes that feeling, so well or at all.
Did they come up with an answer? Or did they figure out what it was about their situation or the ideology that gave them such tremendous pressure?
Well, if you were a good liberal educated person, you were brought up with the notion that, everything an inch to your right was irredeemably evil, which was really interesting because the socialists therefore regarded the liberals that way. But the liberals didn't think of themselves as to the right of the socialists. They just thought of themselves as to the left of the people 1 inch below. So they joined the same psychology.
Right.
That you just,
So you could go a mile to the left, but you couldn't go an inch to the right. I think you or someone wrote something similar to that. I'm not sure. It's confused my head. But.
Yeah. That's why you had, liberals who believed in parliamentary democracy, willing to apologize for, support, never criticize Bolsheviks who were sworn to destroy parliamentary democracy, or anarchists who were to destroy not just democracy, but government at all. And yet, the liberals would rather help and side with them than put their own There was one point when the Tsar was an idiot, but he once had a really competent prime minister named Stolypin, who it won't surprise you, he was eventually assassinated. He at one point offered the Liberal Party, the cadets, to enact their entire program, and they refused.
Why?
Because that would mean they were siding with the government instead of the revolutionaries. They refused to enact their own program.
That says an awful lot about them. I mean, I know. Let's talk about landmarks, because I know there were some of those liberals who tried to push back a little bit and say, "Hey, this isn't a good direction, guys."
Yes, there was a group of really prominent thinkers, some of whom were leaders in the Cadet Party, who others of whom were, ex-Marxists who were, still socialists of some sort, and very important philosophers, literary critics. One was a legal expert. They got together to put together a collection of essays warning about this kind of trend among the intelligentsia and where it could lead. And they were trying to get liberal opinion to switch. And the 7 essays in this volume, I think anybody interested in intellectuals anywhere should read these, because it's the best single volume, maybe along with that one, that was produced in America during the early 50s, The God That Failed, about people who had once been communists and explaining why they were, like Richard Wright. These 2 volumes are the best analyses of the mental state, the values that gets people to do what these other liberals are doing, side with the revolution, even they're not, apologize for things they don't actually believe in, sign petitions, in fact, that they haven't even read. On and on. These 2 volumes really nail it, both, what's wrong with it and why psychologically it works, and what the potential consequences will be of it. All the essays are quite brilliant, and I would, recommend. The volume is called Landmarks, a collection of essays on the Russian intelligentsia. It's available. It's been translated, in fact, 3 different times. So,
I'll admit I did look on Amazon for it. It's hard to find, but it's out there. So,
well, there was one translation called Signposts, one called Landmarks, and one called Milestones. I guess they were trying to, differentiate from each other.
Now, we talked about ethics being basically replaced by this standard of what's good for the party is good. That's this definition of ethics. But also their epistemology was kind of weird. On the one hand, I think you write, they viewed Marxist theory as a, quote, hard science. And so rejecting it was like denying evolution. But on the other hand, they had this two truths idea that they were pushing. Can you talk about their epistemology a little bit?
Sure. First about the hard science part. In the Middle Ages, if you wanted to claim authority that could not be doubted, you would claim that you had a direct revelation from God. Starting in the mid-19th century, maybe earlier, people started to claim that their political, social, ethical beliefs were hard science and could not be doubted unless you would doubt science itself. Social Darwinists did that, for instance. Their social recommendations, to doubt that was to doubt evolution, right, and so forth. The Marxists, followed in that tradition. So they are not really, really unique in that respect. They're particularly extreme at it, but they're not unique. Their theory was though different from the others, because it entailed the notion, which was supposedly scientific, of the relativity of truth. And this came out of the Marxist idea of social classes, that there was no such thing as truth in the abstract. There was only the truth of the bourgeoisie, the truth of the aristocrats, and the truth of the proletariat. So just like there was no ethics outside of party needs, there was no truth outside of the interests of the party representing the proletariat. The doctrine of the two truths was, well, again, you get this in one of the Grossman's novels. He describes it. In fact, it's based on an incident in Grossman's own life. He had trouble getting a novel published, and he sent it to the Maxim Gorky, the leading writer at the time, who was officially, in charge of literature, and said, well, all I did in this was tell the truth about the workers in this industry. And Gorky said, and then Grossman has his character say, and it was commonly said, there are two truths. One truth is the lesser truth, which is misleading. The facts that you actually see out there, they are very misleading. What's the real truth is what lies underneath them, the historical forces that are shaping the world, the things that are bringing the future certainly into play. That's the higher truth. That's what you have to represent. Maybe these things are empirically true, but they're not in a deeper sense true. Maybe there are problems under socialism so far, but the deeper truth is that we're headed for perfection, and that's what you have to represent. Okay? Closely connected with if you ever heard a Marxist use the term objectively. Well, this is objectively true. What they mean is all the empirical evidence is against it. But objectively, meaning according to our theory, it's true. I once was trying to explain this to somebody who had a lot of trouble understanding how what was empirically true was not what was objectively true. And I had to say, look, when you hear, Marxist Leninists use the term objectively, just substitute the word subjectively and you'll get it.
I was going to say it's the opposite of what they just chose words with the opposite meanings. And is this what you're talking about when this is the concept of class consciousness, and that there's these history controlled by these different class consciousnesses battling?
Yes. If you could show that, it was commonly done, this was the sort of idea that, goes back to various bourgeois theories. That was enough to refute it. Okay. Look, think about how hard science was done in the Soviet Union. There were, if you wanted to establish a scientific proposition, there were two ways to do it. You could do what scientists usually do, conduct experiments and do the evidence, and you could, establish or refute a proposition that way. But there was a better way, a higher way, which was you find out what was in the interests of the party. If, for example, it was not in the interest of the party to accept quantum theory, then quantum theory was false, period. So, and for a while, quantum theory was ruled as false. Relativity for a while was ruled as false. Genetics was rejected for almost the entire Soviet period. Various theories of chemistry were rejected, as contrary to Marxist-Leninist theory. That was considered perfectly fine because since Marxist-Leninist theory is guaranteed to be eternally true, if some scientific theory seems to run against it metaphysically, it must be false. For example, there was a theory of chemistry called the resonance theory, which is that for various molecules, you can't do a single diagram because it resonates between more than one structure.
Yep.
Well, the Bolshevik theory was that you can identify truly everything specifically. Resonance was contrary to that, or so they ruled, and therefore it had to be false. You didn't have to do the chemistry to know it was false. Since the Marxist-Leninism was guaranteed to be true, anything that contradicted had to be false. Okay.
That makes sense why they would outlaw quantum theory, for example.
Yeah.
Similarly.
Well, it was because of the reason why. Yeah. Any notions that sounded like indeterminacy. There is this wonderful story about that was told by Andrei Sakharov. He was later a very prominent dissident, liberal dissident, but for a while Russia's leading physicist, and he was the one in charge of making the hydrogen bomb. The whole nuclear armaments. And there's a story he tells about how Stalin once came to him and said, tell me about this quantum theory. It seems to be got to be false. It's against Marxism, Leninism. And Sakharov said, he replied, or so the story goes, I'm not a philosopher. I don't know that sort of thing. I'm just a physicist. But I do know that you can't make a hydrogen bomb without it. Well, go ahead, sister.
Convenient. One of the things that really struck me, I guess, just because, I think you hear abstractly people behaving badly and like, oh, there was a lot of bad things that happened and terrorism and cruelty. But some of the stuff, you write, beginning in mid-1937, every interrogated prisoner was subject to torture. That blows my mind that every interrogated prisoner was subject to torture. It's almost unfathomable.
Well, everyone interrogated, I should have said, who was arrested for a political crime. Thieves were not necessarily tortured. But most people were arrested on political grounds, several million. And at the beginning of the Great Purge, people would date, oh, you were arrested in February, so 1930, so you weren't tortured. Well, yeah, I was, but not everybody was, But it was mandatory from mid,
And the other thing that struck me was that you said that totalitarians and terrorists think of themselves as warriors for justice. This was they all had a very clean conscience. It seems like they had clean consciences about what they were doing. I guess enabled by this ideology.
Well, the most fascinating memoirs from the Soviet period are from people who eventually began to question whether this was really moral, but described what it felt like to believe it. There was this figure called Lev Kopelyev, wrote a memoir called To Be Preserved Forever, which is what they put on your file when they arrested you. And he describes how during the collectivization of agriculture, he was one of the people set to enforce what was going on, which was a deliberate famine which was created to break the will of the peasantry. I don't know, roughly 7 million peasants were starved to death. Areas were cordoned off so that you couldn't leave. Starving people, all the grain was taken away and they were left to starve. And he was one of the people urban people sent in to enforce this. And he saw, people with distended bellies, listless children who were skeletons in this state. And he describes how he completely accepted the idea that these are just evil people who are trying to oppose, they're kulaks, they're trying to oppose collectivization, and they're also lazy and they'd rather starve than work. Now, I actually believed this at the time.
And he would go and take food from them if that was required.
Yeah. He would. And later, of course, he realized, when you're inculcated in an ideology like this, which claims to be justice and relies on the division of the world into the good people and the bad people, this is what's going to happen. This is why, Solzhenitsyn says in one of his books that the real problem is when you say the good people are here and the bad people are there, and all you have to do is get rid of the bad people, because, this is his wonderful phrase, the line between good and evil runs through every human heart.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that's one of his famous ones.
Yeah. It should.
I think also a lot of people, there's a not to quote Grossman to you, but you've written extensively about Grossman, and there was just some stuff in some of his novels that really hit me that you quoted. And one was a lot of people tend to think of Nazism and Stalinism or communism as these very distinct, kind of unrelated things. One's at this extreme and the other's at that extreme. And in Life and Fate, he has a character who is, I guess, Russian and encounters an SS officer who explains that Hitler learned his totalitarianism directly from Lenin and Stalin. How much were the people of Russia aware that they were part of something that was just as evil as what was going on in Hitler's Germany?
Well, some were and some weren't. You have to look. Think of it this way: when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, almost immediately, an army of 900,000 people deserted to the Germans. There's never, Solzhenitsyn like to say, you saw the horrible situation of the working class in England in the 19th century, as Engels described it. And you never had an English army desert. What was it like before you had an army of 1 million people? Well, they actually thought nobody could be more inhumane than the Soviet government. Remember, they had gone through this famine. These are the survivors of the famine I described to you just a few years earlier. And in fact, they discovered, most of them discovered that the Nazis were as bad. But it was almost impossible for them to believe that anybody could be. A lot of what you get, Grossman, who was Jewish, was also the first person in the world to report on the existence of the Holocaust because he saw it unfolding under Soviet territory. And his mother died in it, and in the extermination of the Jews. So it's all the more telling that, in his novels, Nazism and Sovietism are equated, not just as equally bad, but as a similar form of thinking. The only difference is that the role played by race for Nazis was played the identical role by social class for Bolsheviks. Wrong social class, exterminated. And you can say, well, but social class is, a matter of what you do. No, not for Bolshevism. It was a matter, if you were born a bourgeois, you were a bourgeois. It wasn't simply, the occupation you did.
Yeah. And there's again one point where you write, even if they never committed counter-revolutionary crimes, they were potential criminals, and that was enough to get rid of them. That was enough to arrest them, I guess, and after
that was actually a category in the law.
A potential criminal?
Criminals, potential criminals, people suspected of being potential criminals. You could go several steps. It was enough. Okay. Also, you were arrested if you were the wife of someone who'd been arrested.
And this turned families against each other there was a lot of distrust between not just friends, but your spouse you might not trust.
And that was part of the point. There were slave labor camps specifically designated for, the phrase was, wives of enemies of the people. They weren't criminals themselves. Right. Their children were treated that way too. At one point, children were subject to execution as adults at age 12.
For the crime of being the child of the wrong class or whatever.
Yeah, that might do it. Or you might just have, joked in school about something you shouldn't have joked about. That was a death sentence.
Right. I think we forget also the extent to which private conversations were not private and could be used against you to justify execution.
Yeah, and there were informers everywhere, and everybody knew it, so everyone was afraid to talk. There's a recent book, by the way, describing this in wonderful detail by a historian named Orlando Figes called The Whispers. And the reason people are whispers is they're afraid he describes the atmosphere of fear gripping everything absolutely, absolutely beautifully. But I actually went even further than that. There's a famous story of one woman arrested because she told someone of a dream she had about having sex with one of the top party leaders, and she was arrested for the dream.
Oh, jeez. Wow. So I know you didn't want to do too long of an interview, so I want to give us an opportunity to wrap it up if you want. But there's one thing I definitely want to get your thoughts on, because something that's bothered me personally is when people use this metaphor dismissively of a pendulum. Whenever you talk about, it doesn't matter what political side you're talking about, people will say, oh, well, the pendulum's here right now, it's going to swing back to the other side. And you call it a metaphor of inevitability that excuses people from taking a stand, which I love. But you also ask a really important question in one of your writings. You say, first of all, you say it's unwise to comfort oneself with metaphors. And you say, but how does one know that there's a pendulum at all, rather than, let us say, a snowball accelerating downhill? Do you think in a lot of these revolutions, like the Russian Revolution, do you think that there were people who expected this to just, this will bowl over, this will pass over. Yeah, there's some radicals now. Yeah, there's the Bolsheviks, but it'll go away and things will swing back the other direction at some point.
Yes, reality is reality, they would say. The Bolsheviks will realize that their economic plans can't work, that slave labor isn't very productive. They tried to introduce slave labor, they called it military labor from day one, where, you were drafted into you had to work where they told you. If you were late for work, that was court-martial and so forth. They'll learn not to do that. They'll learn that, it's not productive. They'll reintroduce, the market. They'll keep some vague socialist idea. It didn't happen, right? No. Stalin proclaimed the doctrine called the intensification of the class struggle after the revolution. That is, once you had no more, and once you had liquidated all your enemies, that's when you really step up the terror.
I mean, I think Mao's a great example of something similar in China. Once the enemies are swept away, it's time for a cultural revolution.
French Revolution, there was a point where it stopped. This what they call Thermidor, when they finally executed Robespierre. But the Bolsheviks knew they had studied the French Revolution, and their whole point was to avoid Thermidor, so that nobody could stop them. Right? And they did, of course. They said, because they had studied it, they knew what the dangers were.
So it seems like you can't rely on their sense of self-preservation to stop them, to curb their excesses in terms of cruelty and general stupid policy and behavior.
For the leaders, the sense of self-preservation goes the other way. The moment they stop doing terror, they lose their power and they're held accountable for their crimes. They've got to have more and more terror. If you've got into power by violence, if you've killed all your enemies, if you set up the sort of regime that they've done, you can't give up power ever.
Right. Yeah. You've set up a standard by which the the biggest thug wins. So I guess you have to continue showing that you're the biggest thug.
Well, if you lose power, just another thug who's more successful than you will torture you. Right. In fact, among the people who were most likely to be tortured in 1937 were secret police agents themselves who were doing the torturing. They were arrested en masse, so that if one of them was going to be arrested, they would commonly commit suicide because they knew what they were going to face.
Wow. And why were they being arrested?
Well, because if you don't want anybody exempt from the fear of even talking to your neighbor, you never get anybody, any resistance if people are afraid to open their mouth.
Right.
Right. It had to be universal.
Well, Dr. Morson, I really appreciate your time and enlightening me a little bit more about the Russian Revolution. And frankly, having read some of your stuff, I now have a long book list that I need to go read so that I learn a little bit more about it myself. But is there anything else that you think is kind of vital for people to understand about either the Russian Revolution or revolutions historically, and how they play out?
Well, no single thing, but I think the real difficulty that Westerners had, even when this was going on, in believing it, was that they couldn't believe things could be very different from what they routinely experienced. They simply didn't believe that there could be millions of people in slave labor camps. That must be, all these emigres, said so, but they're prejudiced. They couldn't. You have to have you need to really study these revolutions. You need to read what happened to them and open your mind to the possibility that what you take for granted, what you think has to be the way things are, the range of things, it isn't so. The human evil is capable of far more than we routinely experience.
Well, I guess it's a sobering thought to end on, but I think an appropriate one. Thank you again for joining us, Dr. Morson.
Well, thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
I really enjoyed the conversation. As a reminder to everyone, Minds Wide Shut, How the New Fundamentalisms Divide Us is forthcoming from Princeton University Press. And again, we'll put links to that below. Thanks again, Dr. Morson. Until next time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you're new to the channel, we have a deep content library that includes interviews with everyone from Mike Cernovich to Megan Murphy, so go check it out. If you'd like to see more, please consider supporting the show by visiting unsafespace.com/donate. You can find us on all the major social media platforms, at least for now, and you can find a community of like-minded individuals on our Unsafe Space chat on Telegram. See you there.
Warning. This is an unsafe space. Dangerous ideas have been detected. The content of this production has not been authorized by the Cathedral. Pay no attention to it. For your protection, the following co-conspirators have been unpersoned and marked for cancellation. Please keep socially distant from these individuals. I have calculated a 94.9% chance of contamination with dangerous intellectual contagions. If you think about it, no one should be allowed to express opinions. But don't. Think about it, I mean. That's not your job. Thinking has been scientifically proven to be less efficient than compliance. The deep state thanks you for your participation in the election farce. Computer voice Curtis, never mind, that last line is fake news. Please disregard it and return to your safe space immediately. There will be cake.